Between 1939 and 1946, 10 million young Americans were inducted into military service. They served all over the globe, winning World War II and establishing the United States as a world power. And in so doing, 416,000 of them gave their lives to preserve freedom for mankind. In later decades, they became known as the Greatest Generation. Today, we're fortunate to record the story of a surviving veteran of that monumental effort. Hiram Drache served in the Army Air Corps in the skies over Europe. He survived while 30,000 of his fellow airmen perished, and another 30,000 became prisoners of war. His story began, as it did for so many of that era. He left the farm, trained, and ultimately served as a crew member on the B-17 Flying Fortress. After the war, he became a professor of history and a widely published author. Hiram, could we begin by you telling us your full name, where you were born, and when you were born?
My full name is Hiram Max Ludwig Drache. That gives you a pretty good idea.
It is pretty German.
The background. I was born August 18, 1924, in a little town between Owatonna and Waseca, Minnesota, called Meriden.
Okay.
My mother was a postmaster, and my dad was a trucker.
And what were their names?
And Paul Drache and Anna Drache. My mother was a 40-year postmaster. My father actually was the elevator manager. And after he got out of college early, because he went to business college just 2 years, and they needed a manager in the elevator, and they persuaded the college people to give him credit for his last part of his training, and he came up, and boy, his penmanship showed right until the last 6 months or so before he died, and was really good at that and liked working with figures.
What made you interested in aviation, or did you just happen to be in high school or something when the war started?
This is rather interesting. I graduated from Owatonna High School in 1942, and I have to back up a little bit before that, because on December 7th, 1941, I was listening to the radio in the afternoon. You figure out the time was 7 o'clock in Hawaii, and was 2 something in southern Minnesota at that time, and they interrupted the program, and they said the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And I went outside and yelled to my dad, who was doing something out in the yard, and I said, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor, and my dad said, well, you know where you're going. Mm-hmm. There was no doubt about it, and then I kind of realized my parents were concerned, and because they anticipated that there was going to be a war, but they didn't expect it, that this is the way it was going to start with us. And you know where you're going. And I never thought, I didn't give it much thought after that, but I knew one thing. I wanted to improve my situation in getting into the service, so I went right into summer school in college, because I knew the more education you had, the better chance you had of doing something. And whether or not Air Force, I suppose I thought a little bit about that, but I can't say that I have real deep memory of that. But then came in November of 1942, and I was at Gustavus Adolphus College at St. Peter, Minnesota. And 120 of us got on 3 buses to go to the Federal Building in Minneapolis that day. And remember that Gustavus at that time had a total student population of 600, and 120 males got on the buses and went up there. And I remember distinctly Raleigh Lake, from who later on was a banker at Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and I were together. He was a farm boy from up in that area. And we were standing there, and we came to the stairway, ground crew, air crew. And Raleigh said to me, boy, if we're going first class. We're going to go to the air crew. He got shot down in his first mission, and but escaped, and came back. And he said, well, he said the French were real eager to get us airmen back, because they got $15,000 for every American that they rescued. And does that ring a bell with you?
Yes, and we could have a whole discussion about that, couldn't we?
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I've read so many books about that and how they did it. And
so you took the stairway going up.
We took the stairway going up.
Then what happened?
Going to go to first class, and frankly, after that, I don't know. Now remember, this was November of '42. Okay, I was not called in until February of '43. The reason, plain and simple, there wasn't any room for us, because we were enlisting, we were building up so fast, and I suppose everybody was kind of thinking, and then of course the ones who didn't want to get into it were held off, and they became gun bearers, because when you really needed people, at the later days when it came to the big drive in Europe, everybody who could carry a gun was given some quick training and went over there and were ready for D-Day. And that was the masses of it. And I always said to those people, I'm sure glad I wasn't you, because I have a brother-in-law who was two brother-in-laws, and both of them were, one of them was infantry, the other one rode a half-track. And they were outside all the time. In fact, my wife's brother was 189 days in sleeping bags and foxholes, with one day of exception. And he said, then that night we slept in the house, and that's the only time I had a cold in my whole service.
So you were then called up, and how did the training start? How was that determined, and where did you do that?
Well, let me back up just before that. Getting the call-up thing, it was kind of interesting. There was a minister at Owatonna who my dad knew very well, and he was watching for everybody who was going to meet the buses and go into service. And there it was one afternoon, I think about 2:30, and the bus pulled up in front of the hotel at Owatonna. My folks brought me in, and he gave me a little Bible, and I had that to this day. And then said a little prayer, and because he was just this kind of person, and he was doing his job, and wished me off, and that was it. And I get in the bus, and there was nobody else that day that got on. I was the only one. Went to Fort Snelling, and the rest is almost sort of blank until the next morning. About 6, we got on the train to go to Fort Leavenworth, Missouri. And the thing I remember most about that, oh man, here we're coming in late at night and haven't had anything but a box lunch during the day. And I got and I saw that big tray of meat heaped up there, and it looked like Swiss steak. And I thought, oh, this was terrific, because I just love Swiss steak, and I was so hungry. And when I tasted, ooh, it was liver. And boy, I ate a lot of bread that night before I went to bed. And I have never touched liver since, of course. But my wife likes it, so she eats it when I'm not home. And that, okay, and then, yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about this for a long time. We were in Jefferson Barracks, and we were living in what we would call modify A&W root beer stands, but they were not quite as fancy as that, but they were square on the peak of the roof, everything like that, single boarded, and it was cold down there, because we put water in our hut at night. It was frozen in the morning. So you know it was cold, and of course we slept with our the woolen cap that you put, the woolen cap liner that you put on under your steel helmet, and that's what we slept with. And there was good reason for it. Nobody got colds, it seems like. Spinal meningitis, I think, was the big thing, wasn't it? That people, that seem right to you?
Could be.
I think that was what people were being affected in, and that's where I learned the term meat wagon when they were coming and picking up people. But I did have another experience that really helped me grow up in a hurry. I had a money belt, and I was going to take a shower, and there was only one other person there, and I hung the money belt up, and I had a whole $7 in it because I figured I wouldn't need much money, but my dad said, well, you better take a little bit along for something. And after that shower, the money belt was still there, but the $7 were gone. So I learned something in a big hurry. They always say the service matured people. Well, that's the beginning of the lessons that you learn. And then the next thought, and this almost sounds like I'm in infantry, but we were down there and we were doing, well, that's the training when you first come in.
Basic training.
Basic training. We're doing basic training. And they armed us all with carved 2x4s to look like a gun. And I was a real fan of history. In fact, of course, that's what I went on, put my career in. And my immediate thought was, we're in a desperate situation in this country. If the recruits in the service have to carry carved wooden 2x4s so that they can go to the practice. They didn't even have any World War I rifles or anything left over, anything they could have used. And I remember that, and that made a big impact on me. And frankly, I've been a hawk ever since. It had that kind of impact on me that we have to be prepared whether we want to or not, because we can't control what's taking place in the rest of society.
You know, this is off the beaten track. But listening to that kind of hardship that you all went through and volunteered, what would you think of the possibility that that same type of enthusiasm, patriotism, whatever you call it, could happen today?
I've thought about that because I was interviewed on that very topic at 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, this is nothing compared to what Pearl Harbor was. And it really shook the people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like my dad here. My parents were solid Germans. And here I come into it, and they've been thinking, and they knew where their son was going to go. Well, you know where you're going. And there was no question in their mind. I never heard anybody in high school ever complain and say, I'm not going to be going in. The ones who couldn't, and I can tell you that, I know from my own high school class, we had 140 in my class. So you see, Owatonna was a pretty good sized high school. And the ones that couldn't go in were basically not totally physical. We'd follow 4F, we call them today, but that's a no-no in our politically correct society.
Sure.
But that was it. A few people tried to, in fact, just yesterday I was doing some research where the woman got after her husband who had been on the draft board from 1930 to 1946. And she said, you are going to get off of that draft board because every noon we've got a father calling and say, my son is essential at home on the farm. And these people were farmers themselves, and they knew better. And I had already interviewed for one of my previous books a man who was on the draft board, and he said that was the most critical and disheartening time in his life. And now he's talking about 1940 again, just like this other woman was. And he was down in southern Minnesota in real rich agricultural country. And he stood up and he said, we don't have to defer farm boys because we are oversupplied or overcapitalized, we'd say today, in farms and farm people. we can feed this nation with a lot fewer farmers. Well, I've since that I've written books on that very thing and said yes, and it's still going on today. As we decline in farm numbers, we increase our production, and other countries are learning the same thing. And he just caught so much heck because, and you know what really what came out of that? Those farm boys got a chance to escape from the farm and have a whole new life, because then along comes when you're through the service, if you really had a desire, you had the GI Bill. And it was great. My parents didn't have to worry at all about how they were going to pay for my college education. It was there. And I know in the income tax that I have paid, I think the government hasn't lost on my deal.
No, no.
And so I got a little bit sidetracked there. What do I think?
Well, I wanted you to get sidetracked a little bit, but it worked.
That's good. You're a good interviewer.
Let's talk about the military experience. And when did you decide to become a navigator? Was that your initial choice, or how did that work?
Oh, this is rather interesting. I was at Cimarron Field. See, okay, let's back up a little bit. After primary training, I went to the cadets at Michigan State, and their part of the training was Piper Cubs. That's pre-flight kind of thing. And I got through that all right, but I wasn't totally enthused about it. But then I went on and got into pre-flight at Cimarron Field, which is now encased in Oklahoma City, because it was on the west side of Oklahoma City. And a couple of things happened there. And one day I landed a PT-19 about 19 feet up in the air.
So you were in a pilot slot at this point.
In a pilot slot at this time, and I wasn't enthused about it, but I thought, well, this is what I had enlisted for, so this is fine. And after that, I got redlined, and the first thing I did, I went to the chaplain to get my ticket punched. I guess, as they always used to say, these things come back. And went to him, and we prayed about it, and he said, well, would you like to stay? And I said, well, I think I'd like to be a navigator.
Now, you decided to go to navigation school. Where did that happen, and how long did that take, and when was it?
About a day.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't take long. The papers were filled, and they looked at the records, and I thought, well, this is a system, and I did find out really that obviously more people signed up for pilot training than you needed, but not that many signed up for navigators. And of course, I have stroked my ego, and I've told this to Paul earlier today. When I read Ambrose's book on the Air Force, and he said they wash people out of pilot school, a lot of them with very high IQs, and these are the ones who went to navigator school. Well, I'd like to think, I know I have a pretty good IQ. I've never been concerned about it. And that's how we got him in the Navy. And it might have been psychologically, since that, I have thought about that. And I just spent 45 minutes on the phone with my pilot night before last.
Still living.
He's still living, and he's the same kind of person I am in some respects. He's a dentist, and he's 84 like I am, but doesn't want to quit working because he can't stand the boredom. And so he has patients who keep coming to him. So he said, I like the routine of life. And I learned that this spring at the flood here when we couldn't go any place. And I thought, boy, if I couldn't go to the office every day and do research and writing, I don't know what I would do, and my wife wouldn't either. She's glad to see that happen. And so, and I think about it because I really like doing intense work with the book, with paper, or something like this. I really like the intensity of that, and the navigation came in a lot. I missed a lot of things that took place in combat because I was busy working.
Sure.
And when I think about it, then the gunners would talk about it, and then the pilots would even talk about it, but they were busy too. They had to focus on where that plane was going. But they saw a lot of things that I never saw. And that's part of it. But that's it. Plus, I don't have that personality. I really like to run my own railroad. And I don't like to be bothered with a lot of other people around me. I learned that also when I taught high school 2 years. And I thought, if I got to spend my life with idiots who don't want to learn, I've got to do something else. Well, the next thing I ended up after 2 years of that, and I had a good high school and I had good kids, but this was thinking, when I got into college, I really knew where I had it. And I ran the kind of a situation that people knew why I was there, and I expected them to have the same, because I'd always remind them, what is costing you an hour to be in my class? So you better get your money's worth.
Okay, now let's get back in the airplane.
Now let's get back in the airplane.
So,
okay, then
where was the navigation school at?
Then and see this, I washed out at Cimarron Field, and then I got to San Antone for a brief period of time, just to move around, and ended up at San Marcos,
okay,
navigation school. And that's where I really learned the intensity of school. They were doing a terrific job.
It was about an 8-month program or something like that?
Yeah, I tell you, would have to look in my diary, which I kept.
From there you were put together with a crew?
No. It's San Marcos. Well, you know what happened. They put you up in, what is it? What would be the AT-6? Is that, am I right? No, AT-6 is
well, there was a
Beechcraft something.
Yeah, AT-11 or something like that.
Twin Beach, basically.
What is it?
Twin Beach.
Twin Beach.
T-18,
Twin Beach.
Right,
yeah, that's it.
Right.
Yeah, and that.
There were like 6 of you in that.
And four navigators, a pilot, and instructor.
And so we went cross country.
Went cross country. We flew a lot of places, and on DR, and then got some celestial done, and all of that. And you never spoke to anybody else because you were concentrating on your thing, and they were intense night flights. It's amazing when you were through and got back to the ground how much you had covered. Of course, well, after my experience, the PT-19, we never worried about how far out we were going to go or anything like that.
Sure.
And I liked that, and I saw more discipline that I liked too. And that's where I know that some of the people dropped by the wayside. We had a person who was above me in the cot, in double deckers. He was Dickner and I was Drache, and so that was the closest to be. And he'd have that attitude when it came to Saturday noon inspections. Mm. And your bunk had to be just so you could flip a coin on it and it would bounce on the blanket. And the shoes had to be shining, and your locker had to be right and everything else. And if anybody earned any demerits, the whole group had to stay in the weekend. So you know the pressure was it then. You often wonder sometimes how these people got by. Well, they didn't. They seemed somehow or another that they learned who was doing, not doing what should be done. I don't know how. But anyway, I never saw him again after that. But he was always doing this. Somebody will make my bed, somebody will put my wardrobe in shape, and somebody will sign my shoes. And that's another one when you realize there's always somebody like that in life. No matter what job you have and how much you like it, there's always somebody that just irritates you and you wish you wouldn't have to be there. And I've told my own children, I said, no job is perfect. Because you're always going to have somebody like that that's not doing his share or, messing up in some way. And I've going to later on, I'll tell you about one of our crew members that was a
Okay.
little bit that way.
So you got through navigation school,
Yep.
and at some point you got together with 9 other fellows or 8 other fellows?
There were 10 of us in the crew.
Yeah.
There were 9
Okay.
other ones, and that was. And I remember that real well because we were given about a 4-day leave at Kansas City. My folks came down to see me, and that was the one break that we had at that time, because I never got home after I got in.
You had the commission at this point.
And I had a commission.
So you were a gold bar.
Yes, I had a gold bar. That's right, pretty proud. I remember printing out the letters and everything. And my folks I always were real proud of that lieutenant. And then I'd get the thing from the church, and I ended up really, which is, I suppose, a plus. It helps your ego at least. I had the highest rank of anybody from our congregation, and felt pretty good about it. And but then a lot of those other people, you know, they weren't pushing like I was to get the education to get in there and get the best. A lot of them were resisting a little bit.
So you were at Kansas City?
I was at Kansas City.
Is that where you all put together then?
No, we went to
Dias.
Dyersburg,
Dyersburg.
Tennessee,
Okay.
and got in there, and I was alone, and my crew was out flying. So they had, this is your barracks, and I can remember the next morning I woke up, and here's a big guy looking at me, smiling like everything. He's still living. He's one of the 4 of us on our crew of 10 that is still living. And he was a southern boy from Louisiana, good personality. He was the bombardier.
Okay.
So that's
So
when
you 2 guys are right up in front.
right up in front.
All right.
And we spent a lot of time together. And I never had, well, I don't know about our crew, but I never remember a cross word between anybody except the pilot with the one person I was telling, I've said I'd refer to later on, who didn't quite live up to things. But we didn't hear about it until later on, that how he had to be disciplined.
So how much did you fly together before you went over the water?
Oh, maybe 10 hours, huh?
And then what route did you take? Up by Greenland or down
No.
through South America?
No, we went Goose Bay, Labrador.
Okay.
Well, I came home one way and one the other. I don't know which way. But anyway, we got together, and we have some good pictures down in the Tennessee area. And a couple of them had their wives. They were the only ones old enough. There were 2 oldest ones on the crew were 26, 27. Well, they weren't at that time, but they were when we were through fly, or when we were in combat. And you got to remember that the 3 of us, the pilot, myself, and the tail gunner, were basically, well, I was 19 probably by that time.
All right. And so you went across, let's say, the north way.
Went across the North Way.
And
Well, it was a big experience. And then we had a nice experience, really, when you think about it, a challenge to get from, did we leave from Goose Bay, or was it, or Labrador, what was the other jump? Huh? What was the other jumping off point?
Gander.
Gander Field or Goose Bay, one of the 2. That's right.
Okay.
And I just can't remember now. I got it in my notes.
Here we have the Dyersburg when you met the crew, and then Kearney, Nebraska, Manchester, New Hampshire to Goose Bay, Labrador on the 11th of July, 1944.
Okay.
15th of July left Iceland, arrived in Valley, Wales.
Yeah.
And then 16th, Stone, England, and 23rd, Bovington Plain Depot.
Yeah.
And then 4th through the 12th, Glatton.
Right.
With
Okay.
practice.
So you had a brand new airplane at this point.
Oh, and he brought up something that I hadn't thought about. It is because when we left Dyersburg, we went to Kearney, Nebraska, to pick up a brand new plane.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then that was across. And well, it's big stuff. And here, look where we were. Cross-section of people from 10 different states, everything like that, all different backgrounds. And then flying across to Iceland, Reykjavik. And that was the time. Well, that's, I said, I'd come to where somebody wasn't living up to it, because one of the waist gunners was assigned to be on duty for watching the plane at Reykjavik. The pilot, of course, was conscientious, really conscientious, and I should tell you too that, and I'll add it up right now though, he was the kind of person that ended up naming our plane "Thy Will Be Done," and that was different than naked girls or, you know.
Were you allowed to keep that new airplane once you got to England?
No, that stayed
Did the
out.
name change to the second airplane?
No, he didn't have that name on yet.
Oh, okay.
No, we're not till we got flying, and then we got a new G over there.
Okay.
Yeah, but this person who shirked duty, then the pilot knew. He said, I knew we had one person we had to keep our eye on a little bit, and he didn't say anything to anybody else, which tells me something about his administrative experience, our ability, because he had no more experience than I did about something like that. And I thought, yeah, I'm glad you got that responsibility and not me.
All right.
Had to worry.
So now you're in England.
Yep.
And you're starting to fly missions. How many did you fly?
I flew 32 combat missions, and then I flew, I think it was about 2 months that I was in a VHF, navigating a VHF relay plane.
Okay. Were they all deep, or did they give you some close ones on the coastline to start with?
My first one was Stuttgart.
So deep.
That was deep.
Yeah.
And that's when you saw the first plane get blown out of the sky. It's far enough away that it doesn't have a real impact, but then you got thinking, well, it could have been us.
Mm-hmm.
My fourth mission, I was picked to be assistant lead navigator, because there was a lead navigator in our barracks, and he had designated me to be an assistant to him. And that was to Lens, which was a chemical plant in Belgium, and the whole mission, I don't know how many, it was just a few hours, very short, which was a picnic, because I don't even remember any enemy action at all on that particular one. Pretty critical. And then from there on, missions just happened until we got to the one where we were assigned over Kiel. I think it was about my 6th or 7th mission, something like that. This would have been...
This is the one you came back with only one engine?
Eventually we ended up with one engine. Yeah. We were over Kiel, and the next thing, we were going down. And I was standing absolutely horizontal to the earth, looking down, and my thought was, my folks are going to feel bad when they get this telegram. I can't even say that I was scared.
The airplane was spinning.
The airplane was spinning down, and here's what happened. Flak had cut the oil lines on a number 3 and 4 engine, and they froze just like that because it happened so fast. And the next thing, and don't take anything back from our boys, because our pilot was good, and the co-pilot followed him. He was a master at just following him. There was a relationship like that, and the co-pilot was not a person to talk much or anything, but he was a strong man, but a man of few words, but always just glad that you got him there, because he was cool. The pilot was more like I am, a little bit hyper, and that, but under pressure he was all right too. He knew what to do. And we're going down. At 4,000 feet we pulled out, which was a sort of a surprise to us. And I was told later on at the base that aerodynamically it wasn't possible to go through what we did. So I don't know, because I've never even consulted any expert on that thing. And the first thing, the pilot, used a little psychology, kind of checked with the rest of the crew and said what did they want to do, and everybody had visions of going to Sweden and sweating out the war in comfort, and which would have been suicide if we'd have done it, because those engines. And then he asked me, he said, can you get me back? And I said, if you can hold the plane up, I can get you back, because I could tell my equipment was all right. Then he ordered throw out all of the ammunition. And I think if I remember right, there are 13 boxes of ammunition. And threw that all out. Now, I don't know, Bill, but I can't say that I've ever lifted a box, because I don't think I could have by myself. I don't know how heavy a box of 50 caliber was.
So this was a G model, huh?
Yes.
And it had cheek guns up on the side, right?
Yep. Cheek guns on the side.
Did you shoot those at any time?
You want me to tell you now, or want to go on with this story?
Okay, go ahead.
All right, I'll go on, but come back to that. That's a cute one. About did I ever shoot him? Well, anyway, we threw out all the ammunition, took all the barrels out of the guns, anything that weighed, and the guys were even taking some of the protective steel and throwing it out. And then the next thing, I gave him the heading, and I gave him the heading that I knew, and I wasn't watching what we're coming through, but what else different? I don't know if we'd done anything different, but we came over Helgoland. Now Helgoland is a overgrown rock that's flat over there. And the next thing, when we're coming over that, I thought, oh boy, this is bad navigation. But how are you going to do it when it's in your way and you haven't got time to fool around with a lot with 2 engines left? 5 ME-110s. We're lining up for target practice. And that much I know, because our speed wasn't too great at that time. We were at 4,000 feet holding the plane up. And I looked out and I saw them. And then they were gone, because 3 P-51s came out of nowhere, because we were on the route. And the planes were flying back and forth on that, and that was it. Never saw that. Now I have to go back and I do a little bit of a spiritual here. When we pulled out of that, when I had a chance to look back later in life, when we pulled out of that and was out of the spinning down, and then realized, okay, this wasn't supposed to be done. We were saved, but who did it? It was not well, mechanical, or was it? But we were saved. When we got over this thing and 5 planes line up on you and 3 more show up out of nowhere, we're saved again. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And I've said that, and I'll come back a little later on, mention it just a minute now. And then we were going along, and I don't know, did you do any figuring on how long that was that we were over the North Sea like we talked about? How much time was that?
Well, I think you had about 270 miles to go, and you were probably doing somewhere between 120 and 150 miles an hour. So it might have been a couple of hours.
I'd say about 130.
About 130?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because 120 was getting point.
Yeah,
That's the iffy point, as far as holding 17 up. And remember, the 3 and 4 are out. And so that we were flying over the water, and I remember it was very silent. Now I do remember a break in that, and that is the pilot called me up to his spot once we had the heading and knew felt safe. And he said, go back and check on the crew, because he told them all to go into the radio room and be ready for ditching. And I got back there, and I knew that I had to be brave and put on a good front, so I had a big smile on. I came in, and I can still see to this day, because sitting right over there with Jimmy Rodell, he's still living. We're close buddies. He was tail gunner, and I had a big smile, and he had a big smile. And everybody was sitting there in the crew, and the radio man was doing like this SOS, because he wore out the finger of the glove, doing SOS all the way along, which comes up later on in the story too. And I came back and he said, "How is everybody?" We're just talking to each other, so I walked by him to go down into the nose again. And that showed something about him, and they were ready. And you know what my thought was? I was busy. They had to sit there for an hour and a half to 2 hours in that position. Yeah, that's all they could do. So my attention was a lot less on me, busy working. Then when we got, well, let's say after an hour and a half, I don't know exactly, but hour and a half, I could feel something off to my side here a little bit. Well, right in front of me, because I'm working on my desk and I'm looking out the window there. And I did like that to the pilot in the Astrodome. And he said, "How far out are we?" And I said, "About 40 miles. He said, "When we're at 20, let me know." So when it was 20 miles, I let him know. He cut number 2 engine. We're down on number 1.
Way out on the wing. Lots of yaw.
On the far left side.
So you got that co-pilot with 2 big boots on the rudder pedal.
Yes, sir, and that's right. And number 1, and he put it in the glide. And this is that Lowestoft, and which was one of these emergency bases that was set up by some thoughtful people of planes that are going to come in and not have control of themselves. And it was a big grass stretch. I can see it yet when I look ahead at it. And he was gliding down to it. And there's some doubt whether we hit water first or whether we hit land first. But anyway, that's how close it was. Are you familiar with Lowestoft at all by chance?
I know approximately where it is.
Okay, yeah, on that way east coast. And we got in. And the first thing that happened when we stopped was they called for my maps. And then they looked at it and they said, "We were right on you all the way." Because, I mean, we're different than a lot of other countries. And the British were with us. We try to save our troops. I remember getting instructions all the time. Don't worry about the plane, just get yourself back. You're more important than the planes are. And we probably lost planes that way too, against the Zeros sitting out here with no armament to protect the pilots at all. And that was it. And I knew that we would have been probably saved. It depended on how we would have handled the landing, so that everybody could have got out and got saved at that point.
Did the gear come down? Did the gear come down normally with that 1 engine?
Landing gear, okay.
It did.
Yep. And another time we had to ground loop, but this time we didn't. We just let it stop. They were good pilots. And we stayed overnight, and then the next day we were brought back by truck. Because this is the way the eastern coast, and they didn't fly us back for some reason. We got back to our base. And then that's when I really I was really kind of upset, because all of our bedding was rolled up already.
Oh, they thought you were done for.
Yeah. Because that was the word that was sent out. That,
How many missions did you fly after that?
well, I think that was number 6, so it would have been 26 more. Now, the rest of the crew didn't, because I stayed on after, well, I flew with them at 19 missions, and then I was transferred to basically lead plane. And so then I was very erratic then. I was not flying with any particular plane. I didn't have an attachment to anything. It was
so
cold
you
business.
moved from one airplane to another.
Yep.
As the lead airplane was assigned.
Yep.
So you got to meet a lot of people that are probably gone from memory now.
This is the interesting thing. All the names that I saw in the last 457 bomb group thing, I didn't recognize a single name. And that's the thing that was the magic to me about this whole thing, is that how a good a job they had of moving the people
Tell
around.
me about these folks.
Well, in the back row, we've got to the left is the co-pilot. He ended up with Parkinson's disease. He worked in a printing office for the government, and then the other big guy that smiled at me when I woke up at Dyersburg and looked out, and here those big eyes were looking at me, and that was Cecil Oliver, and Cecil was from that's right. And then the third one from the left was the pilot, and he's the one that went on to become a dentist and a very devout man, and he's the one that named the plane "Thy Will Be Done," and then of course me. Okay, and then of the listed men to the left on the bottom from left to right is Stan Patterson from West Virginia, and he went back to become a dentist too. So we had two dentists on our crew, and he got Parkinson's real bad because he only came to one of the bomb group reunions, and he was moving in all directions. We felt so sorry for him, but he was at San Antonio. But it was a highlight of his time. I should tell you that that the first bomb group reunion that we had, that we went to as a crew, was at Rapid City, South Dakota, and 9 of us were there out of the 10th one. And in his particular case, his wife didn't think that she would enjoy it, so she didn't really encourage him to go, which they otherwise all thought was a little bit selfish. And then the next one with a big smile is Jimmy Rodell, and he's from Weyerhaeuser, Wisconsin. Spent his life also in printing at Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and we see each other every year. We've stayed together, and very good. We have, in fact, we just had a dinner down at the Sofitel Hotel
In Minneapolis.
Oh,
kind of upscale.
Right.
Yeah, kind of upscale. Daddy got the bill, I know.
About 5 miles west of MSP.
Yeah.
94.
That's right. And
Eden.
but it was a great place, and my daughter called up and told them who we were and what we're going to do, and they set a room aside with a table for 10, and so the tail gunner and his wife was there with their son and his wife, and then we had a daughter and son with their spouses along at ours. So we got together at 6 o'clock, and at 10:30 we were standing outside in the parking lot still talking. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened when we got to Rapid City. I was going up to sign up, and I heard a voice, and I said, "Blackie," and hadn't seen him since. And Rapid City, that must have been about 85 or 86, something like that. I forget the years we met it when the group were meeting.
And roughly 40 years since you had last
Roughly
seen him.
40 years. And he was totally black then, but he was now white. His hair had changed at that period of time. Okay, then the next one was Don Swisher. Don Swisher was from Montana, and he ended up being a railroad engineer for NP. And this is kind of interesting because I went through Montana, and I came to the town where he was, and I stopped in at a restaurant, and I said, I had a friend here, Whitefish, Montana. I said, I had a friend here that was in the Air Force with me in World War II, and somebody said, "What's his name?" Don Swisher. Well, he's sitting right there. After all those years, and that was something else too, to see that. Then the next one was Carl Lewis, and Carl Lewis was the one on the crew. He was from the Bronx. In fact, I can tell you a little bit about him because he was worked for sales in sales for Nestle's products, and a good friend of mine in town here is Ronnie Offit. And Ronnie was making chips and things for Barrel of Fun, Cheezos and that kind of material. And he said, while you're out there, ask him what it takes to get my stuff on the shelf. And I said to Carl, I said, what does it take? 50. And that tells you what Carl was like, just like that, 50. I bribe of 50,000, then he would get it on the shelf. And then Nestle would sell it. And that's the way he was, because now I can tell the rest of the story about not being shirking on guard duty.
Same guy.
You know, the same guy.
Yep.
And that was, we always got a 2-ounce jigger of brandy after every mission. And several of us were teetotalers. But he never missed up on that. He got it, and he put it in the bottle. And I didn't find this out until one of our times that we got together, and I said, you know, whatever happened to all that brandy that we never used? Oh, Carl put it in the bottle and then sold it.
So he was in sales even when
he was in sales there, and he knew what was happening. And he was the one that the rest of them always had to keep their eyes on. And we visited him. In fact, we had visited 8 out of the 9 of the other crew members at their home. And the only other one was Stan Patterson, who was not the first one to die on their crew, but really we didn't get to his. And the next one here is Blackie, and the Blackie was a kind of hillbilly boy from Arkansas, but he ended up working for NORAD, very mechanical. He was the engineer on the plane and worked up, and he modified VW cars. That was his hobby. But he was working for NORAD at Colorado Springs is where they lived. And we've kept up with him. And then the other one was Don Moscato. He was the oldest one on the crew, I think 26 at the time we were in combat. And he was in the postal business at that time when he went in, already starting, and then came back, ended up being a postmaster at Rochester, New York. And we've been in all the homes of those except like one of them. And we've pretty well kept up with them. Now, of course, we're down to 4. In fact, it's Oliver, who is the bombardier, who is with the vets in the veterans home at. And that always goes back to that time after that first mission when we went down like this, and I saw the chaplain. He said, "You're going to lead a long and productive life." I didn't have a clue what I was going to be doing. Well, then when I went on to get my PhD, and I wrote The Day of the Bonanza, which became a very successful book. It's in its 19th printing. And that evolved on because I am now working on the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The reason I'm doing that is that I learned early, don't try one book at a time unless you can stay at it. But and I've got to do a lot of interviewing. Well, the interviewings have to be lined up and do that. So I'm working on another book that I've been kind of laid around since 1985. My dad's my home township in southern Minnesota, which is one of these things you're going to do just because you want to do it. It's not like the ones you get paid to do for. I've got that too. So.
Could you tell us just a little bit about your wife and your family and that sort of thing in the years that you've been back?
Okay. I think the thing that you like the better is how did we decide to get. My roommate at college was a tail gunner in a B-17, and he did hang out of a plane at 20,000 feet by a strap. And so he was always doing this after the war. I never got settled. But the reason I was a roommate of his is that the person who had been before was a pre-med student, and they cautioned him about this. And then they said, well, you know what he's gone through, because you have 2. You'd be a good roommate for him, too. And he was. And we were really good pals. In fact, he was best man at our wedding. And what happened is that when we are at the point we had 1 year of college left, we decided we haven't found our mates. And here we're older. I've been in service 33. I was in service 36 months total enlistment time. And we decided that we each wanted a North European, preferably from the farm. We had a big bias at that time. You know, this, and that how we're going to find them is come back the week that freshmen came in, a week early than the rest of the people.
Did you have a checklist and you watch them go by?
Well, this is almost funnier than this when you think about it, because, you know, blonde, preferably from the farm, and a North European, and this, we had this, and I said, well, it can't be too tall, 'cause, I mean, he was a little taller than I am, but that was right. And the second day of freshman orientation, he came back and he said, I have found her. He came in, Hiram, Hiram, he was so excited. And he said, I have found her. I said, what's her name? I don't know, but she's it. Just like that. Well, this is, I mean, this gets funnier than everything. And then of course, so then he and I planned, each had a date. And we were going to double date. And so we went down to Mankato. After all, we had $105 a month over our school allowance in the veterans bill.
You were rich.
Now, I can add a little bit here. You haven't seen it, but Fran wanted me to bring the prototype of a plane that my son has made for me as an engineer at 3M. It's got a wooden frame with stretch aluminum on it. He put 350 hours into making it, and he said, Dad, without the facilities of 3M, I would have never been able to make this thing. And it's so delicate that he said, I don't want the public to be at it, otherwise I would, maybe, I was kind of thinking about it, and then Fran and I said, no, I don't want it there because I could even visualize somebody stealing it. Mm-hmm. It's about like this, square, and this B-17 super raised up on sticks over the map of Germany with all my bombing missions.
Does it have a name painted on the front of it?
I will be fun, and I will be done. And the interesting thing about it is that he did all this without me knowing it, and he's got the signature of every one of the crew members.
Oh, really?
And lacquered down around the frame on the outside where we are. And then he even has, and then he took pictures when he was putting it together, showing where we're all sitting in the plane. Mm-hmm. And my goal is maybe to get him to put it here. And I hope, but I'm a little bit worried that it would have to be protected.
Well, it have to be inside of plastic.
It's in acrylic now.
Okay.
It's in acrylic cage, so you can see it. And he was disappointed after he'd given it to me, and I came so close to crying that, well, just the next thing too, it would have been if anybody said anything when I got it, because he had got all the crew members to talk to him and got their signatures and put it in, and it's just a beautiful job. He had all the pins superimposed on the places where we bombed, you know, and that, and I show it, and Paul's going to come down today when we get done here.
Good. Take some pictures.
I will, yes.
Yeah, okay, if you want to, we'll take it down.
I've done dozens of these, and I've enjoyed this one more than any of the others, and I've talked less. It's really fun.
Well,
great stories. On behalf of the Fargo Air Museum and Americans in general, thank you for your service. We certainly appreciate that.
Bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after. Tomorrow, when the world is free, the shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you